An old man lies in the dim shadow of a desert tent. His breath coming in shallow, labored gasps, places an explicit curse on his own child. He condemns Levi and his brother Simeon to a permanent loss of legacy. The dust settles over the camp at Sinai. The shouting has stopped. The Levites stand before Moses, exhausted. They're breathing heavy, their hands still gripping the iron blades they just used to purge the camp of idolatry. In most standard English translations, Moses looks at these weary men and says, "Ordain yourselves today to the Lord." It sounds formal, clean, and ecclesiastical. It sounds like a quiet religious ceremony, but the original audience did not hear a sterile religious title. They heard a vivid, physical image. The Hebrew phrase, translated as ordain, is mile yad. The basic grammatical meaning is strikingly simple. It literally translates as to fill the hand. In the ancient Near Eastern world, when a person was appointed to a high office, their hands were physically filled with the insignia of their new role. A king's hands were filled with a royal scepter. A royal steward's hands were filled with the keys to the treasury. To fill the hands meant to grant a person authority by placing the physical weight of their sacred duty directly into their palms. The English word ordain is theologically accurate, but the original Hebrew captures the tactile, visceral reality of the moment. Moses is standing before men whose hands are literally filled with swords. He looks at their terrible, costly obedience. They will have no unified land of their own. They will be scattered, isolated, and stripped of territorial inheritance, and tells them that because they did not withhold their own brothers from God's justice, their hands are now officially filled for the Lord. The contrast is absolute. Centuries earlier, their patriarch Levi had filled his hands with a sword of uncontrollable anger. He used it to slaughter a sleeping city for his own pride, earning a bitter curse. At Sinai, his descendants filled their hands with a sword of terrifying obedience. Because they submitted their violent zeal to God's authority, God took the weapon of their curse and transformed it into the instrument of their calling. The Levites would never put the blade down. For the rest of Israel's history, they would serve as the exclusive guardians of the tabernacle, and later, the temple, when worshippers brought bulls, rams, and lambs to the bronze altar. It was the Levites who held the sacrificial knives. They were the ones who butchered the animals, managed the blood, and enforced the lethal boundaries of the sacred courts, ensuring nothing profane came near the presence of God. They were chosen not because they were passive or harmless, but because they possessed the fierce intensity required to protect divine holiness. The sword of murder had officially become the knife of the altar. The transformation is breathtaking. The most dangerous men in Israel, because of a bloodstain that refuses to wash clean. If you ask most people today about the tribe of Levi, this is not the story they remember, are now the chosen mediators of its peace. But this sudden elevation creates a massive theological tension. God has just promised the Levites a blessing, but a haunting problem remains. What happens to the deathbed prophecy of Genesis 49? Jacob did not merely express a fatherly disappointment, he spoke a divine decree. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. God's spoken word cannot be broken, and prophetic judgments cannot simply be swept under the rug. The tribe of Levi is still legally bound by the sentence of a landless, fractured future. If God has truly forgiven them, we might expect him to completely reverse the curse. We might expect him to grant Levi the largest, most unified territory in the Promised Land as a reward for their faithfulness. But God does not erase the ancient punishment. Instead, he does something far more brilliant. When the nation of Israel finally crosses the Jordan River and begins the conquest of Canaan, the long-awaited division of the Promised Land begins. Joshua, the commander of Israel, essentially unrolls the map of their future. Borders are drawn, rivers, valleys, and fortified cities are assigned to Judah, Ephraim, Benjamin, and the rest of the tribes. But when the elders of Levi step forward to receive their ancestral territory, they are handed nothing. no borders, no province, no unified homeland. The chilling words of Jacob from 4 centuries earlier suddenly materialize. In the popular Christian imagination, the Levites are the ultimate symbol of holiness. We think of solemn men in pristine linen garments. Into geographical reality, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. The deathbed curse has not been canceled. The ancient prophecy is fulfilled to the letter. Instead of a unified territory, the Levites are assigned 48 individual cities scattered entirely across the lands of the other tribes. They are fractured, divided, and permanently landless. If you look only at the physical map of Israel, it appears that Levi is still living under the terrible weight of their father's rejection. But the physical shape of the curse is deceiving. While the geographical reality remains exactly as Jacob predicted, the theological meaning of the scattering has been completely inverted. In Genesis, the scattering of Levi was designed as a quarantine. Jacob divided them because they were too volatile, too dangerous, and too prone to uncontrolled violence to safely govern a concentrated territory. But in the book of Joshua, the scattering is repurposed as a divine distribution. God takes the men who were once too dangerous to live together, and he scatters them so that every other tribe has immediate access to his word. The Levites become the spiritual circulatory system of the nation, spread across 48 cities. They serve as local teachers of the Torah, guardians of the cities of refuge, and everyday mediators of the covenant. If they had been given their own isolated province walking through the cloud of incense in the tabernacle, we picture musicians leading the nation in songs of praise, corner of Canaan. The rest of Israel would have been spiritually disconnected from the priesthood. By enforcing the exact terms of the ancient punishment, God brilliantly ensures the spiritual survival of the entire country. But God goes one step further. He does not leave the Levites destitute. In the book of Numbers, God speaks directly to Aaron, the Levitical high priest, and makes a staggering promise. He says, "You shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." This is the ultimate architectural paradox of the biblical story. God takes the exact structure of a curse and fills it with his own presence. The tribe that was disqualified from inheriting the dirt of Canaan becomes the only tribe to inherit the Creator of the universe. The penalty for their ancestral sin becomes the exact mechanism of their ultimate blessing. The Levites have been redeemed. They have transitioned from outcasts to ministers, and their hands have been filled for the Lord. But their intense zeal does not simply evaporate into a quiet, passive religious routine. The fierce fire of their patriarch still burns in their veins. And centuries later, as Israel stands on the edge of another catastrophic failure, one man's sudden action proves that God still values the sharp edge of a Levitical blade. Guardians protecting the Ark of the Covenant, and priests standing in the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the sins of a nation. The plains of Moab are thick with the sound of weeping. Israel is camped on the very edge of the promised land. But a deadly crisis has erupted. According to Numbers 25, the men of Israel have begun to intermarry with Moabite women and bow down to the local gods of Baal Peor. In response to this brazen idolatry, a devastating plague breaks out, sweeping through the tents and striking down thousands. Moses and the elders gather at the entrance of the tabernacle, paralyzed by grief, weeping as the death toll rises. In the middle of this national mourning, an Israelite prince commits an act of unspeakable arrogance. In full view of Moses and the weeping elders, he leads a Midianite princess directly into his family tent. It is a calculated display of defiance against God's law. Mocking the very holiness the camp is desperately trying to restore. Most of the leaders remain frozen, but one man's posture changes. Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron. He is a priest. He is a Levite, and in his veins runs the exact same fierce, uncompromising fire that defined his ancestor centuries earlier at Shechem. But unlike the original Levi, Phinehas is not driven by selfish revenge. He sees the plague consuming his people. We assume that God chose Levi because Levi was naturally the most spiritual, the most gentle, and the most religiously devout of all the 12 tribes. He sees the holiness of God being publicly trampled. He steps away from the weeping crowd. He reaches for a spear. The biblical account is unflinching in its description. Phinehas follows the man into the inner chamber of the tent and drives the heavy iron spear completely through both of them. The action is shocking, severe, and deeply uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. But the moment the spear strikes, the plague tearing through the camp comes to an immediate halt. 24,000 Israelites have already died. But the decisive action of one zealous priest saves the rest of the nation. The profound meaning of this event is found in God's response. God does not rebuke Phinehas for his intensity. He does not tell him that his aggression is unspiritual. Instead, God speaks to Moses and says, "Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them." Because of this act of fierce loyalty, God gives Phinehas a specific reward. He grants him a covenant of peace. This phrase completely shatters our modern assumptions. We usually define peace as harmlessness. We assume that holiness was their natural lineage. But the text tells a far more complicated and far more dangerous story. We think of peace as a gentle, quiet disposition that avoids conflict at all costs. But the biblical concept of peace, shalom, is not the mere absence of tension. It is the righteous ordering of the world. It is the restoration of wholeness. Here, God awards a covenant of peace to a man holding a bloody spear, because Phinehas used his intensity to sever the infection that was destroying his people. Once again, the raw, intense disposition of the Levite is not discarded. It is channeled perfectly to protect the presence of God and secure the survival of the community. This ancient history of swords, zeal, and scattered priests is not just a chronological record of a forgotten tribe. It forces us to confront our own internal wiring. We all have natural inclinations, fiery dispositions, and complex personality traits that we often assume are useless to the kingdom of heaven. And this is where the story of Levi becomes a mirror for the modern reader. When we look back at the bloody, chaotic history of the Levites, it challenges a deep-seated assumption we hold about what it means to be used by God. We tend to believe that spiritual maturity requires personality replacement. We look at the quiet, gentle believers around us. Or we read sanitized biographies of ancient saints, and we assume that holiness requires a mild, passive temperament. If you are naturally intense, highly driven, fiercely protective, or stubbornly unyielding, you might feel like the priesthood of Israel did not begin with a lineage of saintly scholars. It began with a cursed tribe of angry men. Core wiring is fundamentally at odds with faith. When you look at your past, you might see a trail of damage moments where your raw, unedited zeal burned, relationships, caused deep emotional wounds, or operated completely out of control. You might see your own version of Shechem, a place where your intensity became a weapon of destruction. Because of this, you might assume that God's plan for your life is to flatten your personality. You might think He wants to make you quiet, to erase your edge, and to remove the fire entirely. But the story of the scattered priests proves something radically different. God is not in the business of discarding your natural disposition. He is in the business of sanctifying it. He does not want to destroy the intensity He allowed to form inside of you. He wants to take it, wash it, and give it a holy direction. When you look at the Levites, you are not looking at men who were born holy. You are looking at men who were born dangerous. But God took their greatest liability, demanded that it be submitted to His authority, and turned it into their greatest utility. What are you holding in your hands? Perhaps it is a fierce instinct for justice. Perhaps it is a sharp intellect, a deep protective drive, or a stubbornness that refuses to back down from a fight. left to your own selfish devices, that trait will become a sword of vengeance. It will sever relationships, feed your pride, and create lasting collateral damage. But if you bring that exact same, whose defining characteristic was an uncontrollable, deadly rage, their ancestral inheritance was not an altar of incense, but a drawn sword dripping with blood. Trait to the foot of the mountain. If you submit your intensity to the authority of God, it can become the very instrument He uses to defend His truth, comfort the vulnerable, and advance His kingdom. A sharp mind that once cut people down in arguments can become a mind that brilliantly defends the helpless. A stubborn streak that refused to admit fault can be transformed into a relentless endurance that refuses to abandon a difficult calling. The process begins with absolute honesty. You must recognize what your natural disposition is and name the ways it has caused harm in the past. You must place your wiring within the larger truth of God's authority. And then, you must consciously choose to hand the weapon over, letting Him fill your hands with His purpose. You do not stop being passionate. You change who commands your passion. You do not stop fighting. You change what you are fighting for. The redemption of Levi is a profound comfort. It proves that our most difficult extremes are not beyond God's use. But there is a limit to this ancient pattern. Phinehas could stop a physical plague with a spear, and the Levites could guard a physical temple with their swords. But no human priest, no matter how zealous, could ultimately cure the tax, violence of the human heart. The sacrifices offered by the sons of Levi had to be repeated day after day, year after year, because human zeal, even when perfectly redirected, cannot atone for human sin. The story of the scattered priests cannot end with them. It points forward to a final, perfect intervention. His eyes, heavy with age and the weight of a century of wrestling with God, scan the faces of 12 men standing around his bed. How does a tribe move from a father's deathbed curse to the inner sanctuary of God's presence? How do the most dangerous and stable, the story of the scattered priests, cannot end with them? It points forward to a final, perfect intervention. For centuries, the descendants of Levi stood in the temple courts, their hands filled with the instruments of sacrifice. They were the appointed mediators, the fierce guardians of God's holiness. But the book of Hebrews reveals a striking detail. When the ultimate high priest finally arrived, he did not come from the bloodline of Levi. Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. He did not inherit the priesthood through human ancestry. He established a better priesthood through an indestructible life. Jesus steps into the biblical story not to continue the Levitical system, but to complete and transcend it for generations. The Levites maintained the covenant through continuous bloodshed, offering bulls, goats, and lambs day after day to hold back the righteous judgment of God. Their hands were always filled with the knife. Their zeal was historically expressed by striking down the guilty to protect the innocent. But Jesus fulfills the priesthood through a profound, staggering reversal. When the ultimate crisis arrives, He does not take up a physical sword to slaughter the guilty. He does not strike down the camp of rebels, and violent men in the nation become the exclusive keepers of the divine fire. The problem is not that we have misunderstood. Instead, He walks up a hill outside Jerusalem, and He allows the sword of divine judgment to fall entirely upon Himself. This is the ultimate answer to human violence. The fierce zeal that Levi possessed could protect the nation from physical plagues, but it could not wash a single human conscience clean. Jesus brings the true, eternal covenant of peace, not by thrusting a spear through a sinner, but by allowing His own side to be pierced. He absorbs the curse so that humanity does not have to be permanently scattered. He takes the violence of the world into His own body and exhausts it completely. Step back and look at the magnificent architecture of this story. Think back to that dim desert tent in the book of Genesis. Think back to the old man, Jacob, taking his final, labored breaths, looking at his son Levi. He saw a man whose hands were stained with innocent blood. He saw anger that was fierce and wrath that was cruel. He spoke a dark curse of division, scattering, and exile over a tribe that seemed destined only for destruction. He saw a man holding a weapon of vengeance, and he condemned him to a landless future. But the God of Israel looked at that exact same violent, broken son and saw a future guardian of his presence. What a priest is supposed to do. The problem is that we have misunderstood how God works with human nature. God took the precise terms of a father's curse, flipped its internal architecture, and turned the scattered outcasts into the spiritual lifeline of an entire nation. The sword of unrighteous anger was demanded, surrendered, and transformed into the instrument of divine service. God did not throw away the intense nature of Levi. He redeemed it. If God can take the most dangerous, volatile, and cursed men in Israel and invite them to stand inside His Holy of Holies, He can redeem whatever you are holding in your hands today. You do not need to hide your intensity, and you do not need to fear the brokenness of your past. You only need to surrender it to the authority of the true high priest. The ancient curse has been broken. The altar is open, and your hands can be filled. We often believe that to be useful to God, our natural temperament must be flattened, erased, or replaced with a meekness that costs us nothing. We assume that intensity, anger, and fierce drive automatically disqualify us from divine service. This is not ultimately a story about achieving religious perfection. It is a story about the radical redemption of human extremes. Over the course of the biblical narrative, God does not destroy Levi's sword. He changes who wields it and what it is drawn to defend. To understand how a deadly curse was transformed into Israel's greatest blessing, we have to travel back before Jacob's final breath, to a dark afternoon in a city called Shechem, where a young man took justice into his own hands. The event that earned Jacob's curse occurred decades before his deathbed prophecy. It began not in a place of worship, but outside the walls of a Canaanite city called Shechem. Jacob's only daughter, Dinah, had been taken and violated by the prince of the city. This is Jacob, the patriarch of Israel, and he is giving his final words to his sons. Each brother waits in silence. When the news reached the Israelite family, the text in Genesis 34 tells us that Jacob remained silent. He waited, perhaps paralyzed by fear or calculating a political response. But two of Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, refused to wait. They looked at the diplomatic compromise their father seemed willing to accept, and they felt a violent, blinding indignation. They devised a plan that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. They agreed to let the men of Shechem intermarry with their family on one condition: every male in the city had to be circumcised. The men of Shechem, eager for trade and a wealthy alliance, agreed to the terms. But Simeon and Levi had no intention of making peace. They took the sacred sign of the Abrahamic covenant, the very mark of God's holy promise, and weaponized it into a tool for mass deception. On the third day, while the men of Shechem were incapacitated by pain, Simeon and Levi walked through the city gates. The biblical record is blunt. They did not hire an army. They did not announce a formal declaration of war. They simply took their swords and moved silently from house to house, killing every male in the city. They rescued their sister, plundered the wealth of Shechem, and left the streets stained with blood. When Jacob finally confronted them about the slaughter, warning them that this reckless massacre would make, in the entire family, a target for surrounding nations, Levi's response was cold, defensive, and unyielding. Should he treat our sister like a prostitute? This is the expecting a blessing, a promise of land, or a vision of future glory. But when Jacob's eyes land on his third son, Levi, unfiltered nature of Levi, he is a man who cannot tolerate desecration. He possesses a fierce, burning zeal for justice and family honor. But in its raw, natural state, that zeal is catastrophic. It operates without restraint, without mercy, and without submission to any higher authority. Levi took a legitimate wrong and responded with a disproportionate, terrifying violence. This is exactly why Jacob refused to bless him at the end of his life. A man who draws his sword in uncontrollable anger cannot be trusted with a national inheritance. A tribe defined by reckless bloodshed cannot safely govern a concentrated territory. Jacob's deathbed curse was not merely an angry father's punishment. It was a protective quarantine for the future of Israel. Simeon and Levi were dangerous. If they were given a united piece of land, their violent nature would eventually tear the new nation apart. They had to be divided. They had to be scattered. The verdict was spoken. And it seemed utterly final. For 400 years, that curse hung over the tribe. Through the long, bitter centuries of slavery in Egypt, the descendants of Levi carried the memory of their ancestors' devastating failure. They knew they had no unified future waiting for them in the Promised Land. They were the children of the sword, a fractured family marked by a father's permanent rejection. But God was not finished with the men of the sword. The fire that burned inside Levi was destructive, but it was not useless. It only needed to. The room grows cold. There is no gentle laying on of hands. There is no spoken promise of peace. Be tested, broken, and redirected. The opportunity for that ultimate test would finally arrive in the dry wilderness, beneath the shadow of a burning mountain. 4 centuries after Jacob's final breath, the descendants of Levi found themselves standing in the desert dust at the base of Mount Sinai. The scene was bathed in fire and smoke. God had descended upon the mountain in terrifying glory, speaking the words of the covenant to a newly liberated nation. But when Moses ascended into the cloud and vanished for 40 days, the fragile faith of the people cracked under the weight of waiting, fearing they had been abandoned in the wilderness. Israel turned to Aaron and demanded a God they could see. Gold was gathered, melted, and shaped into the image of a calf. What followed was not a quiet theological mistake, but a full-scale descent into unrestrained idolatry. The people threw off all moral restraint, rising up to eat, drink, and indulge in wild, chaotic worship around a golden image. When Moses finally descended the mountain, carrying the 2 stone tablets written with the finger of God, he was met with the sound of shouting. As he saw the golden idol and the wild revelry, his anger burned. He threw the tablets to the ground, shattering them. At the base of the mountain, a stark, devastating picture of a covenant broken almost as soon as it was made. Instead, the old man speaks words that cut through the heavy silence like cold steel. He declares that weapons of violence are in their dwelling places. The situation was critical. The divine presence that had delivered Israel from Egypt was now threatened by the nation's outright rebellion. Moses stood in the gate of the camp and cried out a single, decisive invitation. Whoever is for the Lord, come unto me. A long, heavy silence stretched across the wilderness. 12 tribes had witnessed the plagues of Egypt. 12 tribes had walked through the dry bed of the Red Sea. But in that moment of public confrontation, 11 tribes remained still. Judah did not move. Reuben stayed in place. Simeon stood frozen. Then, a single movement rippled through the crowd. Every man belonging to the tribe of Levi separated himself from the mob, broke ranks, and marched toward Moses. They stood beside him as one unified body. This was the turning point of their history. The men who answered Moses were the direct descendants of the man who had slaughtered Shechem. The same fierce, unyielding intensity that ran through the blood of their patriarch was still burning inside them. Levi had always been a tribe that refused to compromise, a tribe that reacted with explosive force when a line was crossed. But at Sinai, that raw trait was expressed in a radically new direction. At Shechem, Levi's rage was driven by personal pride and family vengeance. He refuses to join their assembly. And then comes the sentence that should have defined the tribe forever. At Sinai, their zeal was driven by a refusal to tolerate treason against the God who had redeemed them. They were the only ones willing to draw a line between themselves and the idol worship that had infected their brothers. Moses looked at these men carrying the weight of a 400-year-old deathbed curse, and gave them an unthinkable command. He did not hand them instruments of worship. He did not ask them to pray. He commanded them to reach down and grasp the very object that had cursed their ancestor 4 centuries earlier. He told every man to fasten his sword to his side. What the Levites did with those swords in the next hour would completely rewrite their destiny. The command Moses issues next is chilling. Thus says the Lord God of Israel. He cries out over the noise of the camp, "Put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp. And each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." This is an agonizing directive. The very weapon that had caused their patriarch Jacob to curse them on his deathbed is now being called upon by the prophet of God. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. The Levites do not flinch. They strap cold iron to their sides and step back into the chaotic, dust-choked camp. They move through the tents, executing severe, uncompromising judgment. By the time the sun sets over the wilderness, 3,000 men have fallen. To a modern reader, this scene is deeply uncomfortable. It feels like a brutal repetition of the bloody massacre at Shechem. But within the biblical narrative, there is a profound architectural difference. At Shechem, Levi's sword was driven by uncontrolled, personal fury. It was an act of arrogant deception and selfish revenge against an outside enemy. At Sinai, the sword is driven by agonizing, costly obedience. The Levites are not striking down vulnerable foreigners to defend their own pride. They are executing justice upon their own brothers, companions, and neighbors who are leading the camp into spiritual death. While the other 11 tribes compromised or cowered, the sons of Levi chose the covenant of God over the comfort of their own kin. This is the central contrast of their story. God does not look at the intense, unyielding nature of the Levites and decide they are fundamentally unusable. He does not tell them to stop being zealous. He does not demand that they adopt a passive, timid personality in order to be considered holy. Instead, he demands that their fierce zeal, it is one of the most unsettling moments in the entire book of Genesis. A dying father, speaking under divine inspiration, be brought into absolute submission to his authority. He takes the most dangerous, volatile trait of their bloodline and reorients it toward his own glory. They act as the fierce immune system of Israel, willing to sever the deadly infection of idolatry before it can consume the entire nation, because they were willing to bear the heavy cost of this loyalty. Moses issues a staggering declaration. He looks at these exhausted men, standing before him with the heavy reality of their obedience still fresh in their minds, and he tells them that their destiny has just been rewritten. He announces that they have secured a blessing from the Lord that very day. Jacob's curse had condemned them to shame because they misused the sword. Now, Moses blesses them because they surrendered their strength to God's command. The tragedy of the golden calf is the exact historical moment where the curse of Genesis begins to invert into the exclusive priesthood of Exodus. But the standard English translation of Moses' declaration often softens the visceral reality of what actually happens in the aftermath of this judgment. Moses does not simply announce, "You have now been ordained as priests." He uses a highly specific, ancient idiom to describe their transformation. He makes a statement about what they are holding, and the physical image hidden inside his Hebrew words completely changes how we understand their new identity.